They came to America chasing the gold. Most of them found something else: the hard labor, loss, and a way to survive. My name is Fee Lee Wong. I came here from China at a young age. I didn't find gold either, but I found a life, the hard and real one. And I held on to it, even when the world tried to push me out. In December of 1876, I left my home in Guangdong, China. I didn't know what waited for me on the other side of the ocean. I only knew that I couldn't stay. My village was poor, the crops were dying, and there was no future left for someone like me, not in Guangdong. I was 24 years old, carrying a small bag and a fragile ticket I barely understood, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, America would let me begin again. I boarded a ship in Hong Kong. The journey across the Pacific felt like forever. The air below deck was thick with sickness and the prayers of men like me. The farmers, sons, and husbands were all running towards something none of us could name. When I arrived in San Francisco, I thought I had made it. But my journey wasn't over, not even close. A word had traveled through the ports and Chinatowns like wildfire. There was gold in a place called the Black Hills. Gold, they said, in the rivers and hills. I followed that rumor east, over mountains, through desert, and through snow. And at the end of it all, tucked between steep pine-covered hills, was a muddy, frozen place called Deadwood. I had never seen a town like it. Deadwood was chaotic. It smelled like smoke, liquor, and horse dung. The men shouted in a dozen languages, all chasing the same dream. It had started just 2 years earlier, in 1874, when a U.S. Army expedition led by George Custer found gold in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. The land belonged to the Lakota people, protected by treaty, but that didn't stop the miners, the merchants, or the railroad. By the time I arrived, the hills were crawling with claims, and Deadwood had become one of the wildest boomtowns in the West. But what kind of life could someone like me build in a place that barely knew I was there? When people think of Deadwood, they picture the wild things, the shootouts, the saloons, and the gold strikes. They remember the outlaws and the gamblers, the miners knee-deep in dust. But that was only one part of the town. I remember something else. I remember steam, the hiss of boiling water and the sting of bleach soaking through raw skin. I scrubbed shirts stiff with sweat, coal, and blood, the leftovers of men who spent their days underground, chasing fortunes they'd likely never find. In the laundries, the silence was peace. The silence you keep when you know the world is listening to see if you'll step out of line. That's the Deadwood I knew, and the one I survived. Like many Chinese men in town, I worked in a laundry. We weren't allowed in the mines. The only work left to us was laundry, cooking, hauling, and cutting wood. It was the kind white men turned their backs on, and yet somehow they still managed to say we were stealing their jobs. Every day, miners dropped off their clothes, sometimes still warm and damp, carrying the breath of the tunnels they came from. Our pay was low, however the working hours were endless, and the air was always thick with steam and smoke. But it was honest work that fed us, allowed us to send money home, and slowly, piece by piece, gave us the chance to build something more. Even when we were doing the work no one else wanted, they still hated us. They shouted at us in the streets, called us slurs, and pushed us off sidewalks. In 1882, the U.S. government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law to ban immigration based purely on race. After that, we were treated like criminals just for existing. We had to carry papers proving we had the right to stay, and even then, we were questioned, doubted, and insulted. I didn't speak much English in those early years. Most of us didn't. It made us easy targets. In towns across the West, Chinese workers were attacked, driven out, even murdered. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, 28 of our people were killed by a mob in a single day. In Tacoma and Seattle, entire Chinatowns were emptied out by force. And in Deadwood, it never erupted like that, but the danger still hummed beneath everything. We kept our heads down, walking in pairs, and learned when to stay quiet. Still, we held on to each other. Our small Chinatown, just a few blocks along Lower Main Street, was our home. It had cookhouses, boarding rooms, herbal shops, and a temple. We shared rice and tea, watched over each other's families, and burned incense to honor our ancestors and remind ourselves that we came from something older, deeper, and stronger than the place trying to forget us. I watched everything, how the town grew, stumbled, and rose again. I watched miners return with black lungs, or not return at all. I saw wagons carrying men who would never wake up again, and even listened to wives whisper their fears while handing me their husbands' shirts, still stained from the last shift. I stitched those shirts back together as best I could, the seams, the holes, the stories they carried. I never strike gold, but I struck something else. The stability, purpose, maybe even pride. I stood beside the other Chinese men, heads bowed under steam and backs aching but unbroken. We were never meant to be seen, but were meant to serve, disappear without names or monuments. But I remember every face in that laundry, every man who stayed, who refused to be erased. However, by the early 1880s, something had changed. I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to live. In 1883, I got married to Ho Shou Gain. She was a fellow immigrant from China. Starting a family in Deadwood wasn't easy. Anti-Chinese laws made it almost impossible to bring wives from China, and mixed marriages were dangerous. We didn't fit their picture of what a family should look like, but we didn't ask for permission. By 1902, we had 8 children, born and raised in this mining town, where gold dust clung to boots and winters bit through walls. Our house was small, but warm. The children spoke English at school and Chinese at home. They learned how to bow at the altar and how to argue over supper. They grew up knowing who they were, even if the town didn't. Around the same time, I opened my store, the Wing Su Emporium. It stood just off Lower Main Street, not far from the laundry shops and cookhouses. But this was something different. It was one of the first Chinese-owned general stores in the Black Hills. Inside, I sold herbs, teas, dried mushrooms, rice, firecrackers, paper lanterns, and tobacco. I sold to anyone, Chinese workers, white miners, and families passing through. For many, the store was more than a place to buy things. It was a place to speak our language, to hear news from Guangdong, to ask about a cousin, and to borrow a coin. It was a small corner of China, right in the heart of Deadwood. And in time, even the town began to notice. Of course, not everyone. Some still looked at me with suspicion, muttering Chinaman under their breath. But others nodded, came to me for help and good advice. We didn't expect the town to celebrate with us. We just wanted to live with dignity, to make something that would last beyond the next gold vein. And for a time, we did. I never owned a mine, but I built a business, raised a family, and carved out a place in a town that told me not to, and that mattered. But even after building a life, a business, and a legacy in Deadwood, I nearly lost it all in 1902 when I traveled back to China. I didn't plan to stay. I only wanted to visit, to see my village, and show my family what I had made of myself. I thought I could come back easily, but I was wrong. The law didn't care what I'd built. It didn't care that I'd raised 8 children or that I was known throughout Deadwood. For them, I was Chinese, and that was enough. When I tried to return, the door had nearly shut. The Exclusion Act tightened its grip. People like me, even after decades in America, had to prove we deserved to come back home. The paperwork, witnesses, luck. I tried it all, fighting for re-entry into the country where I had my home, and finally, I made it back. By 1919, the time had moved on. I suffered a stroke. It didn't end me, but it was a sign that I had to prepare for something I hadn't faced in decades. In 1921, I said goodbye to Deadwood for the last time after 43 years of surviving mines, mockery, racism, and a country that treated us worse than anything just because we were Chinese and not American. So what do you think? Should stories like Fee Lee Wong's be remembered alongside the legends of the Wild West? Let us know in the comments. And if you're drawn to forgotten history, Don't miss our deep dive into the Santa Claus Bank robbery, one of the wildest heists in American history.